At a first glance, one would not consider Frankfurt to be a hub for postmodernism or postmodern architecture. O.M. Ungers was based in Cologne, where he practiced from 1950 until the early 2000s. He passed away in 2007. But also, he was based in Berlin and Ithaca, New York, at Cornell University. Yet the city of Frankfurt holds a particular significance for his work, and today I will relate Ungers to this city. We will see how in a particular historic moment Frankfurt played a role in Ungers' evolution as a designer, and I will try to show how it offered an opportunity to challenge the codes of the architectural profession. For this transgression of professional codes, we must understand the place that Frankfurt holds in the iconography of Germany. Interestingly, this place is often tied to architectural or urban architectural narratives. These images have been politicized over time or endowed with specific architectural and cultural historical ideologies. You see here images of the Frankfurt kitchen, the Neues Frankfurt, sort of social democratic moment of the Weimar Republic, where, like in Hamburg, Berlin, Frankfurt was a key city for the housing reform, and of course its building director Ernst May working on a series of housing projects, a sort of a circle periphery. And obviously Grete Schütte-Lihotzky, the Viennese architect and first actually practicing woman of Austrian architecture. She is the one who has her big break developing the sort of Fordist kitchen that goes into many of these Neues Frankfurt kitchens, and you see one here. It was also reconstructed. There's one one could see at MoMA a couple of years ago. Anyway, these are images, of course, tied to the sort of modernist Frankfurt. There's the, I think, second or third Siam conference tied to the existence minimum, which is held in Frankfurt before, of course, the end of Neues Frankfurt in 1933. So these images inform contentious narratives, not only the Nazi narrative, but everything since. Especially contentious after 1968, Frankfurt becomes a showplace where modernity and tradition, local identity, and global rootlessness have repeatedly clashed, resulting in monikers such as Bankfurt or Manhattan. These are monikers that Frankfurt's been given, was given in the 1970s, particularly city of banks and finance. Today, Frankfurt is the seat of the Euro, the European Central Bank, being housed to the east of the center in a tower by Kolb Himmelblau, which you see here. Quite significantly, this tower straddles and penetrates another modernist masterpiece, the wholesale market, the central market designed by Martin Elsässer. So that's another key figure of the Neues Frankfurt. The central market building you see here is sort of the now coral reef on which Walter Prix has produced the European Central Bank headquarters, this tower. Not only will I be talking about the Frankfurt that Ungers encountered, but also about the role that this city played in the emergence and circulation of postmodern architecture in Germany. So it's a companion piece to the show that Sylvia Levin has produced in a way. This role of Frankfurt is somewhat forgotten today, however. Over the past 30 years, Berlin and the architectural politics of reunification have somewhat eclipsed Frankfurt. Moreover, Ungers himself had a relationship with Berlin that impacted his teaching, his built work, and his research. Ungers' Green Archipelago, a metaphor manifesto from the mid-1970s, experienced considerable interest in these past years and saw quite some recent debate. This reading has been seen as a sequel to Learning from Las Vegas, but also related to Delirious New York, produced by Ungers' Green Archipelago co-author and student at Cornell, Rem Koolhaas, shortly afterwards in 1978. So these are reasons that postmodern and post-unification Berlin has obscured Ungers' work in Frankfurt. But what interests me in particular is that when Ungers' career was stalled for nearly a decade, it was relaunched not in Berlin but in Frankfurt. Not only did his many building commissions in Berlin and elsewhere, only later did many building commissions in Berlin and in other cities come about. not the bruised, scarred, and fundamentally invigorating urban terrain of the former capital Berlin, but West Germany's financial center. Its secret capital is actually where Ungers resumed his building practice in the late 1970s. But what was the Frankfurt that Ungers encountered in the late 1970s? Just like contemporary West Berlin, it had an identity that was formed by the condition of post-war Germany and the entire catastrophe of that nation state. Gaining clout as business center and transportation hub in the geographical center, the post-war republic used Frankfurt. It symbolized the German economic miracle of the 1950s. Prior to that, in 1949, it had even been considered as a candidate for the capital of the new republic, before Bonn was chosen, which had more intact building stock to house the new government institutions. A pretty primitive reason that the small Bonn and not the larger Frankfurt was then capital in 1949. It had indeed been heavily bombed, its historic center practically obliterated in 1944, like many other German cities. But Frankfurt recovered rapidly, its airport a driving force, along with the headquarters of the U.S. Forces European Command that occupied the former IG Farben office building by Hans Pölzig, this famous chemical corporation which was consolidated and then housed in the Pölzig headquarters, notorious, of course, also because IG Farben was then essentially also part of the, of course, chemical program delivered to Auschwitz and the machinery of the death camps. But regardless of that, this building had survived the bombing of Frankfurt in 1944, and until the early 90s, it is where the American headquarters were of the West. In a divided Germany, Frankfurt was therefore well-positioned while also connected to an international scale. Its airport soon became one of Europe's largest. Moreover, Frankfurt inherited the role as Germany's banking center from pre-war Berlin, thus becoming an interface between the national and the world economy. This strategic position was reflected in a physical and architectural reality. I began with some images showing how architecture has repeatedly conveyed the city's identity, including these more recent images, and here it is again. But I will now go, of course, into these images in the period that is so central to Oswald Matthias Ungers. With the rise of a critical public opinion after Reconstruction, or after the completion of Reconstruction in the early 60s, unlimited development began to be blamed for an alienating urban environment in Germany. Criticism was voiced by groups ranging from preservationists and members of the local bourgeoisie, but the sacrifice of identity for the sake of profit was, of course, also attacked by the left. Here, groups outside the sphere of traditional politics were particularly vocal. One needs to mention that Frankfurt University was one of the major sites of dissent in 1967 and 1968, when the post-war consensus and the technocratic welfare state of Germany came under attack. Consumer culture was targeted physically in the same year, making Frankfurt and its shopping paradise center the birthplace of the Red Army fraction. Some of the group's future members firebombed 2 downtown department stores, and 3 years later, the actual headquarters of the U.S. forces in the Pölzig building were bombed, again by RAF terrorists. 2 highly mediatized events that set off the violence spiral that would culminate in the terrorist attacks, kidnappings, and hijackings of 1977. Another facet of dissent on Frankfurt was the Häuserkampf, literally the fight for houses, which was amongst the first European squatter movements. It was less about preservation, such as the movement here in which Phyllis Lambert was involved, than about affordable rents and the right to the city, of course, this discourse being very much received in Germany in the late 1960s. This fight for affordable housing in the historic West End neighborhood clashed with real estate interests that represented the ever-expanding CBD of Frankfurt. Häuserkampf produced a conflict that was highly publicized and that made the contested skyline a national symbol. Frankfurt's traditionally social democratic city administration was now attacked for its pro-development stance and its failure to understand an evolving urban environment. Massive urban renewal schemes and generic office towers exemplified a twofold negative legacy. On the one hand, the top-down planning with massive public investment, along with, on the other hand, the real estate pressure in the city center, threatening what little there was left of pre-war residential urban fabric in Frankfurt. In turn, the paltry reality of contemporary German architecture contributed to the city's tawdry image. Its alienating downtown, individual isolation, the futility of any act of resistance in Frankfurt, as well as the presence of terrorism in the 1970s, are also conveyed in numerous films by Rainer Werner Fassbinder, who was theater director at the Theater am Turm in Frankfurt in the mid-1970s before returning back to Munich. But there were a series of his films, images, two of these films, In a Year of 13 Moons and Mutter Küsters Fahrt zum Himmel. These images are taken from these films that give very, very stark images of the alienation and also the loss, sort of traditional class, working class, bourgeoisie, intelligentsia, divisions, all these things being blurred and mixed in this alienating urban environment driven by real estate, driven by, we could say, modernization. This all comes together in these masterpieces from 1974 to 1978, which is the Year of 13 Moons by Fassbinder. Already with the onset of recession in 1973 and the oil crisis, dissatisfaction with a municipal policy focused entirely on accommodating the service sector began to grow. In 1977, the Social Democrats finally lost the municipal elections in Frankfurt. The following years, under a new conservative mayor, set the stage for a different direction. Walter Wallmann embarked on a scheme to locate cultural functions in walking distance from the city's contested bank towers and main shopping district. The ambitious promotion of culture had to do with identity politics that were adopted by the mayor and his cabinet, to which, something one must also emphasize, social democratic politicians also belonged. For example, the Secretary for Culture, Hilmar Hoffmann, was a social democrat who had already served the previous social democratic mayor and who was taken into the new coalition. But now Hoffmann's budget was given a spectacular increase that offered him unusual dimensions to operate with. Municipal politics after 1977 targeted groups different from the voters who had traditionally benefited from subsidized housing and who were historically to be found amongst Frankfurt's working and lower middle classes, for whom the new Frankfurt had been proposed, the utopia of the Weimar Republic housing. That, of course, by the 1970s had completely lost its political and ideological relevance. The new mayor, Walter Wallmann, embarked on a two-pronged strategy that combined locational politics with heavy investments in the infrastructure of high culture. His administration sought to create an urban experience geared towards a contemporary public composed of employees, shoppers, and, of course, tourists. A society now based on mobility, increasing affluence, and needs for distraction and distinction. Taking into account the new importance of historical preservation, the potential to correct Frankfurt's image was identified in the visibility that the historic core could achieve. The historic core, which had been tabula rasa in 1944, and with a sort of very minimal reconstruction in the 1950s and 60s. Culturally somewhat suburban, Frankfurt underwent a process of remaking under Walter Wallmann and his culture secretary, Hoffmann. The key element of their policy was the string of new or expanded museums all in the center and along the River Main, as well as the reconstruction of the former medieval core, which you see here partially in this image. The structures that would be erected during a decade were either additions to existing buildings or entirely new museum buildings. The architects that received commissions, usually by competition, belonged to a generation that was working very differently from the sort of German mainstream at this point. What they produced in Frankfurt granted contemporary architectural trends a heightened visibility. not only culture, but the actual act of sort of architectural production in a sort of contemporary sense was becoming visible. Fused with the realm of high culture, these architects benefited from a different kind of exposure than their colleagues involved in office construction or in subsidized housing. Richard Meyer, as you see here, this image built slightly after the architecture museum that we'll be looking at. He became the architect of the German Museum, or the Frankfurt Museum of Applied Arts, Decorative Arts, and it became the first commission in a long string of museums that Meyer would go on to build. The Height Museum in Atlanta shortly afterwards, and of course a huge segue of European work in France, in Germany, in Switzerland, but this building really set him off, very similar to the effect that the Vitra firehouse had on Zaha Hadid's career in the early 1990s. So this is something that Richard Meyer produced adjacent to Damm. We will be looking at Damm, which was, as I said, built nearby. Deutsches Architekturmuseum, the German Architecture Museum, as that's what Damm stands for, Deutsches Architekturmuseum. I'll be speaking of Damm from now on, so bear with me. Nearby to Damm, the historic Städel Museum of Fine Arts was already located on the same riverbank, which was now rebranded as Museumsufer, Museum Riverbank, the riverbank of high culture. This is how the city designated its new zone of cultural addresses opposite its downtown on the North Bank. So the architecture museum, which we're looking at, the image you see here on the right, is this spot. This is the image that we saw prior in the medieval core, adjacent to the former, well, it's not the cathedral, but it's the dome of St. Stephan, which is sort of just a sort of an anecdote. It's where the Holy Roman Empire crowned its emperors until Napoleon. So sort of the old history of Frankfurt is one of a kind of global city, not just of finance. The past 40 years, it was in the Holy Roman Empire, the seat where this federation of the many small states, kingdoms and duchies and church states that composed the Holy Roman Empire under Habsburg rule, they agreed on Frankfurt as a free imperial city, which had no aristocratic power. It was a burgher city, and for that reason, their church, although the city was reformed, remained a Catholic church, and that is until 1781, I believe, is where these Habsburg emperors, which were in a ritual, they were elected by the electors and crowned in the cathedral here in Frankfurt. So it is, we could say, in a way, a holy ground, in a way, for people who are interested in the history of the sort of Holy Roman Empire, which lasted until Napoleon smashed Europe in early 1800s. That is just what I'd like to say for the location of our now in-depth discussion of this building. But before that, there's also one other dimension, the Second German Reich, not the third one, the second one, the Wilhelminian Reich, dominated by the Prussian kings, unified in 1871, of course, created this capital of the German Reich, which is Berlin in 1871, and that is where the Museumsinsel, the museum island, was created, and there's a conscious reference to that in Frankfurt with the museum riverbank to the historic museum island in Berlin, which you see here on the right image. It is by the two arms of the Spree River next to the Berlin Schloss, currently being reconstructed. This front building everyone knows, of course, Schinkel's Altes Museum was the first building in that complex where, until the end of the Wilhelminian Empire, the state built a series of magnificent museums to rival, of course, Vienna, London, and Paris, and to, in a way, present its power and cultural authority in Europe as this young nation state. So that Museumsinsel, which is currently has been refabricated in the 1980s and 70s, was, of course, located in the heart of East Berlin. It was, we could say, the communist sort of backyard. The communists had, of course, blown up the Schloss, the seat of imperial and royal power, and the museums of the Prussian kings and German emperors were what was left. And by the time, of course, Wallmann and Hoffmann created their Museumsufer concept for Frankfurt, there was, of course, this yearning for the historic, we could say, seat of high culture, research, and collections, which was part of the former capital of Berlin, now in the eastern half. So no one could have dreamed in 1977, when these cultural politics were developed, which you see on the left image in blue, that one day Berlin would again become the Museumsinsel with these major sites, with David Chipperfield dolling everything up and creating sort of a tourist mecca. So we see the ambition of Frankfurt as the new economic capital, wanting to position itself in the cultural footsteps of the former capital, the heart of which, East Berlin, was in communism, as I just said. So we look now at buildings that were also threatened by demolition in the 1970s, and the city was, in a way, very smart to move forward and purchase these buildings and prevent their demolition. There was initially the plan to do a film museum, and here on the right-hand building, our building, the future architecture museum, was supposed to house a combined facility, a museum of contemporary art and an architecture museum. After negotiations, these programs were split, and the museum became a pure architecture museum, whereas the Museum of Contemporary Art was built adjacent to the former cathedral in the core of the medieval Frankfurt, on one of these many vacant sites. It was designed by Hans Hollein, a contemporary of Unger's. Hans Hollein had actually been the first choice to remodel the villa here that we're looking at, the Dom building. Hollein was then given the commission, or actually he won the competition. This was a competition later on, which Unger's actually did not win, and that's why we have the Museum of Contemporary Art here and the Dom on the riverfront, dedicated to architecture alone. Founded in 1979 and opening to the public 5 years later, Dom was one of the first products of the new cultural policy of this coalition government. It was housed in a neoclassical residence dating from 1912, a bourgeois doppelvilla, a double villa, a two-party townhouse, hence its unusual four-bay riverfront facade. So as I saw today in the visit with Lev, this is the same thing that you have here, a former double villa. There's almost an uncanny quality of similarities here between Montreal and Frankfurt. Given that the load-bearing structure of the 1912 Doppelvilla was unsound, the building was then gutted, not like your beautiful interior. This increased the project's scope and became the premise for Unger's appropriation of the entire site of the former villa. The result was a series of interior and exterior manipulations. The building's existing relationship to its immediate surroundings is severed by a red sandstone plinth that occupies the entire surface of the property. Unger's extended the footprint of the townhouse to fully occupy the property at ground level. A plinth with a squat colonnade became its new street front. Behind the house, to the rear of the property, a series of courtyards were punched into the plinth. A large one, a patio including existing three, and then additional micro courtyards for sculpture, initially intended for model sculpture, at the very back of the site. The framing gesture emphasized the fact that the new museum would be housed in an empty shell, an artifact. At the same time, the sandstone plinth heightened the new institutional identity of the host structure. Unger's almost elevates it to a shrine, as if to demonstrate the new status of architecture in the precinct of high culture. A sequence of spaces encircles the core structure, leading the visitor from the street to the back. Ample clerestory windows, as well as the use of sandstone cladding and a stucco rustica, which you see here on the right, transform the ground level into a series of miniature streets and piazzas and courtyards. This alternative urban reality turned the former neoclassical residence into a small town. Similar to some of his earlier designs, Ungers revisits Leon Battista Alberti's analogy of house and city in his design. The 1912 townhouse is positioned in the middle of this highly formalized urban miniature system, adopting an onion-like organization of its plan. A ring of offices and ancillary spaces is positioned directly behind the facades of the gutted structure. This outer shell surrounds an atrium that houses a stack of galleries and, in the building's ground and basement levels, an auditorium. Embedded in the center of the onion, we find the house in the house. Spanning all 5 floors of the disemboweled townhouse, this white structure holds a series of galleries that culminate in the abstraction of a pitched roof. Except for local access points, this feature is detached from the building's outer shell. I remember myself as a sort of young teenager, my grandparents lived in Frankfurt. I once visited this building. I understood very little of what it was about, but it stunned me. And I did not see that there were floors above the ground floor. I actually totally missed these hidden staircases, which you need to imagine here in this layer. And I returned and, of course, was then amazed by what I saw inside this white space in the 1980s. The existence of the house in the house is totally invisible from the street, also for preservation reasons. There was no way to have it perforate the roof of the building. There's an earlier variation of the project by Ungers that actually does that, but this hiding away of the house in the house is all the more powerful. That is what generally, I think, the positive also response to his idea has demonstrated. It is oddly disconnected from the ground floor public circulation. So there is an unusual organization rationale that allows Ungers to isolate his compositional idea in the very heart of this building as a surprise and casting the visitor into a highly formalized spatial sequence and a sort of a vertical thrust, an atrium that he initially wanted to go from the ground floor all the way up to the roof. That was then cut for acoustic and fire protection reasons, and also to create more gallery exhibition space, which you see here on the right. That's the second floor. Suspended in a void, the house in the house appears as a stereometric representation of architecture in a primordial state. The white prop was, in fact, built in cast concrete, all traces of which were suppressed. These construction photos here are actually taken by museum director Heinrich Klotz and provided by Damm and some of Klotz's ample slide collection I also saw in the show, in the show today in one of your galleries. So these are pictures of the director on the construction site of his future museum. The purest result of Damm is indicative of Ungers' desire to reposition architecture while doing away with the imperatives of construction, texture, and expression. We are confronted with a watered-down representation of the primitive hut, as depicted in the 18th century essay Sur l'architecture by Logier and the famous frontispiece etching by Charles Eisen from the 1755 edition. Distilled into a minimalist module resting on corner posts, the house in the house is itself an attempt to reaffirm architecture's truths and eternal values. Where Logier sought to replace fashion with simplicity and essence, Ungers is equally searching for a timeless truth to architecture and its practice. When his museum opened in 1984, he jokingly suggested that exhibits should be held elsewhere, as his house in the house already conveyed significant truths about architecture. The abstract ethereal interior is infused with Ungers' architectural thinking, suggesting that design is the intellectual product of rigorous formal operations and continuous metamorphoses. Something that we see, of course, in this time also in the work and writing of someone like his colleague, Peter Eisenman, of course, going in a different direction, where transgression, of course, leads to a whole different formal research on complexity, but this idea of metamorphosis and, of course, autonomy and the doing away with structure, technology, all these things we have in both Eisenman and Ungers. Ungers was not as much the theoretician until these years in the late 1970s, where his theoretical writing and publications began to pick up. And finally, 1 year before DAM opened, actually in 1983, Ungers released Architecture as Theme, a theoretical publication that is precisely centered on these operations of metamorphosis, analogy, and image. The Frankfurt Museum represented the first institution of its kind. It was 7 years before, for example, CCA. Not a mere department within a museum, but an entire institution devoted to the presentation of architecture and to the collection of architectural drawings and models. It served as a transmitter between a world of abstract concepts and a contentious and criticized building practice. Its founding director was Heinrich Klotz, a charismatic art historian, active promoter of Ungers. Klotz also exerted considerable influence in the transformation of the urban and cultural landscape of Frankfurt, as we will see later. His museum was instrumental in the incipient mediatization of architecture production in Germany, taking many a cue from developments in the Anglo-Saxon and Italian contexts of the 1970s. Tellingly, in his 1984 inaugural exhibition, Revisions of the Modern, Postmodern Architecture 1960-80, Klotz introduced a largely foreign polemic to the architectural backwater of Germany. Crucial to his show was the display of the collection of drawings and models assembled since the museum's founding in 1979. In collecting these artifacts as a focus for his new museum, Klotz had set the agenda of presenting the design process as a speculative and formal endeavor, so very close to what also Ungers himself is interested in these years. Klotz's acquisition policy, already a tradition in the architecture department of MoMA since 1932, now met with the academicizing trend towards paper architecture so characteristic of the 1970s. This coincidence, of course, met, of course, also the opening of a specialized art market and soaring prices, much to the dismay of Klotz, who had no private backing for his museum acquisitions. And as I learned today, actually, one of his models that he was not able to buy because he was outmaneuvered was the Gehry House in Santa Monica, of which he then had his model shop build a replica. So he was very pragmatic, he was charismatic and pragmatic in a way. He wanted the people to sort of also see what was going on the West Coast. He wanted sort of people to really engage with this form of architectural production that was so, we could say, shocking and absent to Germany in the 1970s and 80s. The position of DAM in the emerging landscape of postmodernism is indeed unthinkable without taking into account the experiences that Klotz and also Ungers had gained in the United States. Before they first met in Berlin in the mid-1970s, they both taught in the United States, Ungers at Cornell University and Klotz at Yale. Klotz would in fact later be considered as a potential successor to MoMA's Alfred Drexler. A couple of years into the Frankfurt DAM direction, he was approached by MoMA. A result of his American exposure was the 1973 publication of the oddly transitional Conversation with Architects, featuring figures such as Philip Johnson, Kevin Roche, Paul Rudolph, Bertrand Goldberg, Morris Lapidus, Louis Kahn, Charles Moore, Robert Venturi, and Denise Scott Brown. Then, in 1976, Klotz undertook a similar project in Germany where one of his conversations involved Oswald Matthias Ungers. And both men concurred in the interview that West Germany was trapped in a dated positivism and oblivious to the critical positions and narrative richness by then prevalent in the Anglo-Saxon and, of course, Italian scenes. International exposure impacted the perception of Ungers' work at home, as indicated by the remark of critic Martina Düttmann at a Berlin symposium in 1976. I quote Düttmann here, "Oswald Matthias Ungers is a voyager. He brings the architecture of other countries to Berlin in his suitcase. This is why his own designs are always exotic, always formalist, always exciting." End of quote. Ungers' career is characterized by his absence from building practice for almost 1 decade. the period from which this quotation on travel and exoticism stems. His academic experience in the United States was crucial since it coincided with troubled years in Germany. The physical distance from his home country encouraged him to theoretically reflect upon his own work. And before we look at other Frankfurt work of his, I'd like to provide some of the backstory from the 1960s and 70s here. Prior to 1968, we have a prolific practice in Germany, Ungers being very active, and then one that resumes with the building assignments in Frankfurt and then in Berlin. There is also a precursor in 1978, a brief precursor, when Ungers was given a mandate for subsidized housing in Berlin, an infill building site, this is the image here, quite typical of the changes in urban planning underway at this time in Berlin, the tentative attempts at preservation and infill housing. But the press to this building here in Berlin, Charlottenburg, was so negative with elements of schadenfreude that Ungers again stepped back from building. And ironically, the Schillerstrasse housing turned out to be a repetition of the troubles that he had encountered 10 years earlier when he struggled with the limitations enforced by Berlin's housing bureaucracy and was criticized heavily for his own work. The traumatic experience that was thus confirmed must be seen as reinforcing his belief in an architecture of conceptual rigor, of refusal to stoop to what was imposed by the system. And this authenticity was exactly what was encouraged at Damm. Nevertheless, there are hidden continuities. Ungers had built his career upon housing, addressing issues of standardization, group form, and process. Born in 1926, Ungers became an unaffiliated, unofficial member of Team 10 in the 1950s, but his modernist roots ran even deeper back to post-war reconstruction and to the generation of his teachers. After graduating from Technische Hochschule Karlsruhe in 1950, and I won't go back any further than that, Ungers had set up his practice in Cologne. In 1963, he was appointed professor of design at TU Berlin, at the Technische Universität Berlin, supported by Hans Scharoun, himself a living link to organic functionalism, the glass chain, and the heroic period of modernism. Ungers' tenure in Berlin coincided with his work on Märkisches Viertel, a super project on West Berlin's northern outskirts, then underway. In this subsidized housing development for 50,000 inhabitants, Ungers was one of 6 assigned designers. Beginning in 1967, the German megaprojects, of course, became a perfect target along with the welfare state, technocracy, and the bureaucratic agencies and institutions tied to mass housing and the building industry. Märkisches Viertel offered one of the foremost images for the press and for the general public for the brewing attack on the habitat that the welfare state had produced in the post-war West. These unrestrained attacks on Ungers for his work in housing and also for his role as a university professor became the watershed experience for him. But regardless of such disappointment and shock, Ungers' work took on an increasingly systemic and abstract direction over the following years in Berlin and at Cornell. His research even veered towards the exploration of an infrastructuralist urbanism and an industrialized building technology at the moment where these things were under attack. This is demonstrated by the publication series released through his chair in Berlin and then in Cornell between 1967 and 1970. Ungers and his collaborators attempted to recast architecture and urbanism around organizational and managerial priorities. It was in fact a typical response of this time when ever larger projects, of course, prompted architects to engage with the construction industry, and this was seen as a conceptual challenge to be met. In an attempt to win the battle with technocracy, Ungers' studios, research, and designs were premised on growth and systemization, but not the systemization of form as he was later going to embrace in his postmodern period. For example, studio projects like Berlin 1969 or Ungers' own design for the Tegel Airport from 1966, which you see here on the left, were both driven by an infrastructuralist agenda and prefabrication. The isolated architectural object was obsolete in these years, having lost, quote, Ungers said, its importance as a self-contained unit, end of quote. To him, architecture was now, quote, defined by its degree of integration with systems of organization, space, traffic, economy, technology, and social life, end of quote. These Berlin publications show Ungers and his assistants steering away from form and emphasizing building technology and, we say, demonizing the architectural object and sort of the craft of building in a traditional sense. For example, in 1967, a publication was dedicated to Paxton, but less to the object than the assembly line logic and the monumental qualities that Crystal Palace, of course, then generated through its fabrication process. But on the other hand, and now we come to this sort of added complexity and layering, we also see traces of Crystal Palace in this earlier design from 1965. In this competition, Ungers was not involved with housing, but with a new museum complex at the Berlin Kulturforum. The building would have been located between the buildings by Scharoun and Mies, recently completed, the Scharoun Philharmonic, or in the case of the new National Gallery by Mies, under construction in these very same years. The glazed concourse, which you see in the center of the axon, would have been a tribute to Crystal Palace, its glass spine running through the architectural collage. But in his design, Ungers emphasized the encounter of a very diverse languages, typologies, and even technologies in this one cluster of a museum project. Everything, however, tied together by the indoor street, by this linear element. So the composition is also a harbinger of the miniature city and the Alberti metaphor that reappears in Frankfurt in the ground plan at the German Architecture Museum. The Kulturforum project also shows Ungers' interest in juxtaposing identities. This is a clear counterdynamic not only to Scharoun and its Philharmonic, but particularly to Mies and the National Gallery. It is also a counterdynamic to the very same infrastructural environments that Ungers was so interested in these same years. Yet his 1965 design for Kulturforum shows the poetic temporal approach that he applied to his thinking on Berlin 1 decade later. The idea of an urban landscape structured by strong identity fragments. Cities in the city, as he would call it, or the Green Archipelago, this montage of fragments in the shrunken fabric of West Berlin, the product of the Cornell Summer Academies. The 1978 manifesto became better known, of course, as the Green Archipelago due to the voids that surrounded the islands of urban fabric that were researched by Ungers and his collaborators. By juxtaposing urban fragments, Ungers sought to come to terms with what characterized West Berlin in this moment. The Green Archipelago addressed shrinkage and obsolescence, thus the opposite of the dynamics in Frankfurt where his building practice would very soon resume. As we will see next, in Frankfurt, Ungers revisited some of the morphological experiences from Berlin, as I've pointed out now in several instances. And one such clear example is the reference to Paxton's megastructure, the Crystal Palace in Hyde Park. Ungers' work at the Frankfurt Fairgrounds overlapped with the Damm Commission. Lasting through the entire 1980s, his involvement with Messe Frankfurt was instrumental because the fairgrounds established his corporate practice in 1980s Germany. Ungers would go on to design office buildings, retail developments, a Supreme Court in Karlsruhe, and before his death in 2007, vast additions to Berlin's historic fairgrounds. But more than in all his following building commissions, the Frankfurt Fairground project was where Ungers was able to pursue his interest in the abstract and iconic. Now, this is on the scale of corporate architecture. Now he's doing this on the scale of corporate architecture, where he has to organize crowd flows in a very generic, non-controllable environment and to provide visual identity marker buildings in this otherwise already existing fairground site of Frankfurt. Located to the west of downtown, the vast site was and is an island that is governed by its own logic. So the insular thematic that we just saw in the Green Archipelago, in a way, indirectly reappears now here in this commercial project and the work for Messe Frankfurt. Ungers was, of course, not the big building specialist anymore, so he was teamed with chief planner Albert Speer Jr., the son of Hitler's Albert Speer, who ran a prolific urban planning and architecture firm in Frankfurt. Speer Jr. and Ungers working together on this site. In 1980, sort of as a kickoff, Ungers presented his Agora scheme for the Frankfurt Fairground. The same year also saw work on his projects for a connector building between an existing and a new convention hall, the latter designed by Ungers. And housing the administration of the Frankfurt Fair was Ungers' Torhaus, literally the gateway building. The slab building, which you see here on the right, began construction in 1982, so really an overlap with the German Architecture Museum nearing completion in the same year. To the left of this image, we see how Galleria, the concourse building referring to the Crystal Palace section, was inserted between vast, flexible spaces. Here, the sort of front appearing in the middle of the image, and here the inner space. Galleria is an infinite tube based on an extruded section. The transparent vault offers different readings, of course, fluctuating between an abstract, systemic, extruded condition and the monumental, unique presence as a specific object inserted into the fairgrounds. Its arches appear almost as structural supergraphics, which I find quite interesting also in the representation here, this drawing by Ungers' studio from the early 1980s. Although its program can be adapted for different uses and is by nature, of course, endless and generic, as a space, the Galleria is clearly an attempt to introduce and formulate a civic space with traditional iconography, similar to the scheme from 1980, where Ungers proposed this idea of the agora. But compared with the association to ancient Greece in the agora, the term galleria is, of course, much more commercial in making the reference to the 19th century urban malls in Milano, Rome, and, of course, Naples, the gallerie of the Italian 19th century. There is also a clear link to commercial work happening in these years in the United States, such as Caesar Pelli's Winter Garden at the World Financial Center, known as Brookfield Place since 9/11. We can also see the attempt to produce an indoor city with historicizing features at Brookfield Place, especially when we relate Pelli's Winter Garden to the neighboring World Trade Center, to Yamasaki's towers, with which it was indirectly forming an entity. And we can also, of course, read Frederick Jameson's concept of hyperspace into these commercial macro environments here in New York and also in the Frankfurt Fairground. The disorientation produced in the urban renewal projects of John Portman are related by Jameson to late capitalism and how this encourages a perceptual logic and bodily presence in individuals that is different from the 20th century, classic 20th century perceptions. Jameson discusses hyperspace as a product of Portman's, or a symptom of Portman's camp late modern architecture and its fluid, repetitive typologies. Portman's urban renewal projects, known for their vast retail, hotel, and office conglomerations that were endowed with comprehensive horizontal and vertical circulation systems, that precisely blurred the quality of exterior and interior space. Like Portman's signature atriums or Pelli's Winter Garden in Manhattan, Ungers' Frankfurt Galleria is a controlled environment in its own right. The entire fairground is an urban island, as I already said, where spectacle, transactions, and consumption are held together by a complex circulation system with these signifying architectural supergraphic elements. Such an artificial aggregate, we could also refer to Colas's junk space here, is in itself unspecific and lacking in identity and, we could say, civic presence. Providing a response to these deficits is precisely what Unger's mission was about, delivering features that would energize the fairground and make it specific, make it different from other fairgrounds in Hanover, in Leipzig, in Hamburg. There are, of course, many competing German metropolises and fairground traditions, and Frankfurt has always tried to be the biggest one, but Hanover is often beat Frankfurt. Hanover also where the 2000 World Expo then took place. So back to this fairground and Unger's work, some of the features were, of course, entire buildings like the Galleria or the Torhaus. The Torhaus in the tower that you see here on the left of this model, the abstraction prevailing in Unger's work offered a potential. There is a merging or a collapsing of volume and symbol, producing an iconic effect. It became, in fact, the most pop project that Unger's ever built, I would say. One can see an abstract, almost super studio quality in the way the gridded shaft slides upward almost in motion as a sort of an endless system. But compared with super studio, or even with the seemingly endless extruded tube of Galleria, the tower is not placeless. Instead, it has the quality of a site-specific object. Inserted in the geometry of dissecting rail lines, it serves as a sign for the fairground for people on the train or on the outside of the fairground in the Frankfurt downtown. Again, a metaphor, the gate, Torhaus, instills meaning here, or a narrative on the edge of this contained insular site. And to use Unger's words, Torhaus is also a thematic building. Recall, this is the years and also in which architecture's theme is published, first in Italy, and then by Rizzoli, Unger's theory of themes of architecture in 1983. Like the Architecture Museum, Torhaus is the illustration of the theme of morphological interpenetration, which you see here. It is a house that is lodged in the house, fused with the shaft of the tower. Of course, it requires some imagination to imagine this, but Unger's has referred to this building as also endorsing the house, or the house in the house, the Russian doll principle here, and the shaft of this administration tower at the Frankfurt Fairground. So we can say that Unger's introduces a degree of self-referentiality to the most generic and flexible spaces of something like the Frankfurt Fairground. In part, his work involved the repackaging of existing structures, the simple decoration, cladding existing fairhalls into a tectonic graphic pattern, also the collaboration that I mentioned with Albert Speer Jr. These acts of refabrication of the Frankfurt Fairgrounds were in turn celebrated by the client, as this flyer for the inauguration of Galleria in 1982 shows. The invitation incited the recipient to assemble a paper model of the new buildings. So the model-like quality of Unger's architecture comes full circle here as built paper architecture. The clients of Messe Frankfurt are supposed to be brought on board into the self-referential architecture of Unger's, the designer of the Galleria. The architectural enhancement of the fairground brought another designer to Frankfurt. I'm just going to do a little small detour, but we'll be right back and coming to the end pretty soon. Who is this other designer, also from America, a German who wound up in America, in Chicago? You might guess it's Helmut Jahn. Dwarfing the Torhaus, Jahn's Campanile Tower was geared to provide the fairground with a yet stronger presence in the city skyline. You see here how it dwarfs the Torhaus in the background. When completed in 1991, the Jahn Tower was Europe's tallest. Moreover, it was the first high-rise, really tall building to embrace a more narrative historicism, sort of this neo-deco, as one can see in its elevations, materials, geometry, and of course also in the evocative name of Campanile. So these references to the merchant city, Venice, Frankfurt, a merchant-free city, referring to, of course, these traditions of merchant republics in Venice. All these attributes, of course, seem pedestrian, trivial today, but they clearly reflect the desire of museum director Heinrich Klotz for a more narrative approach in architecture. And we can see how this more narrative approach by the late 1980s has really now entered and colonized, we could say, the discourse of investors, how investors are really comfortable with this kind of, we could say, iconicity, and also so the play, the language games, in a way they embrace this, and we can see here how happy they are. On the very right is Jerry Speyer of Tishman Speyer. Tishman Speyer was the main developer of the Messe Tower of the Campanile by Helmut Jahn. This is sort of the competition moment. Heinrich Klotz is not in the image, but he was also part of the jury, as he was in several other cases, particularly in the museum juries in Frankfurt during the 1980s. So we see here this now sort of ludic element here that kind of is a companion to the production of hyperspace and to this historicism of architecture, such as Jahn's or eventually Ungers's. Ungers, Klotz was, we could say, a very, very savvy operator, and he would live on to see how this architecture became more and more successful, but he would also at one point distance himself and was horrified by then the post-unification development of Berlin and this sort of pure historicism in the reconstruction of Berlin, and then engaged in sort of very, very critical polemics. And by any way, he had somewhat distanced himself from architecture, as in 1988 he went on to his next endeavor, which was becoming the founding director of a new institution, was the ZKM, the Center for Art and Media Technology in Karlsruhe, another prestige project of a sort of conservative politician of Lothar Späth, who founded this very ambitious art school / media art collection and research center, which initially, some of you may know, there's a wonderful project by OMA from about 1989. Again, this is Klotz, who is trying to grandfather in OMA and Colas to his new institution, but that doesn't happen because they then move and they actually go into a former arms factory, and that is where ZKM operates to this very day. It's where Sloterdijk is based and other important figures, but it's not about architecture. So Klotz, in a way, he kind of graduated away from the material realm of built paper architecture, and we could say postmodernism, into the world of ZKM and new media technology and art. He was, as I said, an art historian by nature. Klotz in Frankfurt encouraged linguistic pluralism. I'm repeating myself. He was less invested in an academic discourse than in rekindling the disenchanted public's interest in architecture. At the same time, he provided a cultural capital for real estate developers such as Jerry Speyer and others, making the commercial high-rise palatable and interesting in a way it had not been since the 1970s. There's also a high-rise exhibition at Dam and a publication, a kind of a coffee table publication by Klotz on Hochhäuser, on high-rises in the late 1980s. So we can say, as an institution, Dam was key to the transfer of architecture into the symbolic economy of the postmodern city. By showcasing the conceptual side of architecture production, its director sought to distance its practice from the pure provision of services, from the technocratic professionalism that functionalism had become in post-war and 70s 19 Germany. The prime example for this transformation of architectural practice is, of course, Unger's own trajectory since the 1960s and these excesses in public housing and sort of systems planning. The aura of conceptualism is what makes his white spaces so highly symptomatic in their time. For a discipline that after 1968 had become so overly self-conscious, his design of DAM emboldened architecture with a new narrative. The didactic rigor of the museum interior is a representation of an architecture understood as culture. Its embodiment in the house im Haus was also what Klotz wanted to convey, to present architecture as a discipline with a resilient formal logic of its own. The discourse of autonomy was beholden to an institutional setting, however. Frankfurt's highly mediatized architectural products relied on factors that were external to the discipline. In the case of Dam, this was founding director Heinrich Klotz and the politicians backing him. Ungers successfully inserted himself in this setting and was able to relaunch his practice, as we've seen. Moreover, he did this in a cultural climate that was characterized by a reappraisal of history and urban fabric. Heritage allowed Frankfurt Mayor Wallmann and his administration to distance themselves from previous urban governance. It was perceived, these previous practices had been perceived as soulless and technocratic and as having sacrificed the urban environment. An instrument of such governance, functionalist planning and mass housing were seen as out of step in the mid-1970s, both by the political left and the right, as I said before. So the far left, in a way, on the same page as also preservationists and sort of conservative burghers who are just basically fighting to have their city be protected from development. In retrospect, Unger spoke of his trauma designing mass housing in Berlin, where he had been, quote, manipulated by the institutions, end of quote. As an underlying question, however, his extended career and success raised the issue of cause and effect. How consciously did Ungers anticipate the new public role of architecture in the postmodern city? Or how much does the conceptual and formal direction in his later work represent a personal quest, a line that he would have pursued regardless of the socioeconomic setting? The narrative of the personal quest was the one perpetuated by Ungers himself in his writings and by numerous of his critics in his day and to this very moment, from Fritz Neumeyer's so-called unconditional architecture to, of course, Pier Vittorio Aureli's counterform to the forces of urbanization. That is how he has glorified the green archipelago as also counterform to what Colas then does in the captive globe and the sort of glorification of capitalism in modern New York. So this counterform of urbanization, as Aureli sort of frames Ungers' work in the 1970s, is seen as something resilient, which I do beg to defer from, because it is very much in line with preservation, with things going on in Berlin, with occupation movements of historical housing, with new modes of funding, mortgaging, and the general sort of socioeconomic slack and crisis in which Berlin was in the 1970s. And Ungers, as we have seen, 3 to 5 years prior to that, was on a completely different trajectory with his sort of systematic or systems environments that took on a quite different direction. But narratives that frame autonomy also glorify architecture as an act of resistance. We've seen how this claim for an architecture as architecture, in Ungers' case, was a strategic asset to gain entrance to a new client base. It is characteristic of the 1980s, just like the large housing corporations were of the 1960s when Ungers designed Märkisches Viertel in Berlin. Ungers' decisions were situated actions that took into account the changes in the field of architecture production. As a case study, Frankfurt demonstrates how the urban condition shapes this field. In the beginning of my lecture, I looked at the particular place that Frankfurt held in the iconography of post-war Germany, and also how this iconography was often tied to the urban realm and architecture therein. Architecture was the city of functionalism. Neues Frankfurt was, we could say, almost as important as the Athens Charter to this early heroic moment of modern architecture and its international, we could say, mediatization. So the transgression of the professional codes attached to functionalist architecture was all the more salient once a postmodern visual regime had taken hold of this very same city. In response to its perceived physical ugliness and the lack of cultural distinction, Frankfurt evolved into the signature architectural city of Germany, we can say. In negotiating scales, postmodern urban governance offers a novel task for architecture, designing interventions that can mediate between local interests and the increasing competition between metropolitan regions. As I said, Fairgrounds one example, but also, of course, the competition of regions through new museum architecture, and this is 10 years before, of course, the Bilbao effect and Gary's Guggenheim. In contrast with the Fordist tradition of planning, the era of Mayor Walter Wallmann combined cultural and locational politics. Yet, although scaling back its involvement in subsidized housing, the public sector never shifted to the neoliberal mode of governance characterizing contemporary Britain or the United States. Rather, the new spatial symbolic priorities in Frankfurt did not entail the deregulation of planning and an embrace of market forces alone. The distribution of new museums and the refabrication of the city center indicated a shift in the public addressed by a welfare state that was beginning to adapt to new forms of production and consumption in post-Fordism. This shift in the audiences and territories now targeted required a different expert culture in design and in architecture. For Ungers, the local Kulturpolitik in Frankfurt certainly opened up a path to building commissions that reinvigorated his stalled careers, more museums and fairgrounds, corporate headquarters and courthouses. Pared down to the most recognizable and elementary and ceremonial typologies, his increasingly corporate institutional work claimed for timelessness. Underpinned with the cultural capital of a personal architecture theory, Ungers' mute phenomenology and self-referentiality became a highly visible commercial signature. At the time he reemerged in Frankfurt, he had endowed his own work with the retroactive theory, as we've heard. He sought to rescue architecture from the, as he said, dead end of functionalism. Gravitating towards a discourse on images and metaphors, he was invested in the iconic and the archetypal, pursuing a phenomenological abstraction that suited so well, we could say, the generic spaces of this postmodern city with its sort of moments of heritage and legacy. These images are, of course, from Ungers' research and the publication, City Metaphors, that you also have here on sale, and a re-edition from the New York City show Man Transforms, curated by Hans Hollein. So we have this linkage now, Frankfurt, New York City, Cooper Hewitt Museum, new curatorial and, of course, self-referential architectural practices, and the work on the image here in Ungers' own publication called City Metaphors from 1976, really leading into the moment that we've looked at in DAM, but also in the Green Archipelago. In an essay, Ungers identified the white interior of his museum as a, quote, continuous interchange of inside and outside. Indirectly, these morphological transformations reappropriate the modernist trope of universal space. Formerly targeting the entire city, the discourse of continuity and universality now addresses design operations that are confined to the site of one property, to the museum villa. Hovering between representation and reality, the gutted building played an active part in organizing a new form of spectatorship. There is often indeed a pedagogical tone in Heinrich Klotz's own comments on his new museum building. He said, for example, its presence takes shape in spaces of white light, and actual silhouettes, forms, and meanings emerging as if from an abstract metaphysical sphere, end of quote. It is the dawn of the era of starchitecture, and the architect is reintroduced as an auteur. The museum director is the savvy promoter of a professional practice that soon colonizes the inner city in Frankfurt and many other cities. Theoretical reflection was instrumental for the mediatization of architectural products, as one excellently, of course, also sees here in Sylvia Lazin's show. Therefore, Klotz was keen to elevate and broaden the discourse of architecture and also to bring in the new publics, the new urban publics. Indirectly, this elevation is also what appears in the auditorium at DAM. The four columns of the house in the house form a white baldachin that endows the speaker with a quasi-liturgical presence when addressing the audience in the lowest level of the DAM. Here, Ungers' theoretical construct frames this perfect white space. His house in the house anchors the discipline amongst what Pierre Bourdieu has called sanctified products. Located on this lowest level of the vertical section, the sunken auditorium becomes a sanctuary to which the visitors gain access after the, quote, ceremonies and rituals, in Bourdieu's words. These rituals are the premise for a participation in a discourse on an autonomous architecture, such as the one defended by Ungers and Klotz. For a select audience, his postmodern primitive hut becomes the abstraction of an 18th century abstraction. Its formalized geometry is stripped of all material and atmospheric presence, in Ungers' words, quote, transforming pragmatic reality into the metaphysical world of ideas. And to quote him one last time, a filigree space that raises the awareness to the possibilities and perhaps also to the limits of architecture. Thank you.